What they cannot and will never understand is that what they and other liberals call populism is political blowback against the social disruption that their policies have produced. They can't understand the connection between what they've done and populism.
Today's guest is very much an original thinker. He's independently minded. Of course, everyone likes to think they're independently minded, but over the course of his career, he's pissed off just about everyone. He first shot to the forefront of the national conversation about 25 years ago, writing a trenchant critique of globalization and being entirely skeptical, pessimistic even, about the possibility of a successful war of occupation in either Afghanistan or Iraq. On both counts, he was proven right. Now he's turned his attention to the West. He says that the pieties of recent decades, cultural, social, and economic, are over, that the status quo can't carry on, that we're very much at a crossroads. So what next? He thinks the future will, in many ways, resemble the past. Perhaps things like religion, ultra-nationalism, maybe even feudalism, might be on their way back. Big questions and different answers to what you'd hear elsewhere. But that's what we like here on Downstream. John Gray, thanks for joining us.
Very pleased to be here, Aaron. Very pleased to be talking to you today.
We're very happy to have you. I just wanted to start by saying I first read you around 2001, False Dawn, and thereafter Straw Dogs. But False Dawn, I think, was the first time I'd read you. I was 17. For me, that put you on the map. Obviously, you existed well before then, and we'll talk about that as well. What was the response to that book? Because it was a very provocative thesis at the time, namely that globalization, ever larger swathes of the planet falling under the guise of liberal market capitalism isn't necessarily going to happen, and maybe it has some big downsides. And some people didn't quite agree with your conclusions, did they?
Well, it was considered off the wall because it was published at a time when globalization as a mood and an idea and a profitable project was at its height. So if I'd been calculating the time to do it, I wouldn't have done it then. And the reviews it got were, without exception, with one exception, I think a friend took pity on me halfway through the process, but were all extremely negative. I mean, normally my books polarize people in a Marmite-like way. This didn't. Everyone hated it. And I thought at the time that, and I think I still think this, it simply went against the mood. The Cold War had ended. It was supposed to have ended in victory. Although even 10 years before I published False Dawn, I'd written in a conservative magazine a piece on Fukuyama's essay before he wrote the book. The essay came out in the fall of 1989, before the wall came down. But very close to the time when it came down. I had written then that the coming collapse of communism, which I thought was going to happen, would be the resumption of history on very traditional lines. It would not be the end of history at all. I mean, I think I later joked it was rather like one of Beckett's stories which contains the line, "the end again." It wasn't the end of anything. It was the resumption of history, because the Cold War was a rather anomalous period in which global politics, not completely because there were the non-aligned movements and so on and so forth, but was organized in a binary opposition between two Enlightenment ideologies, and that was very liberalism and communism. They both spring from the Enlightenment as a broad family of ideas. And liberalism appeared to have won, but I never thought that it had won because it was liberal. I'd knew some of the people in Poland who were, and other East European countries who were working against the Soviet control of their countries. And some were intellectuals, but many were religious intellectuals. Some were Catholics. Many were nationalists. I mean, what brought down communism was not intellectual dissent, and it wasn't economic inefficiency. It was solidarity, the Roman Catholic Church, and Baltic nationalism. Now, so even before it happened, my interpretation of the weakness, the fragility, and the ultimate collapse of the Soviet project was completely different from that of Western liberals. My interpretation of it was that what was happening was that these regimes were becoming illegitimate, even in Russia, ultimately. But before that, in communist Europe and in the Baltic states, they were becoming more and more illegitimate and hollow, even among their servants. Even the elites were less and less willing to use force to rule. And that this was not because liberalism was spreading as a universal ideology. It was because in nationalist and religious and other traditions and particular forms of life and thinking in these different countries were reasserting themselves. So I never expected that it would turn into a universal liberal hegemony, not for a single moment. So when I, 10 years later, published False Dawn, I wasn't surprised either. I was surprised by the intensity and the consistency and the near uniformity of the negative reaction. But then I reasoned, that's because we're at the height of this project now. It'll take a while. And it took a long time, actually. It took almost till now that the globalizing project would fragment, partly fragmenting because of things I didn't anticipate, like the pandemic. Although I do say in Straw Dog, someone reminded me I'd forgotten that if you have long-term plans, don't ask your financial advisor, ask an epidemiologist. Because even then, 2001 or whatever, 2002 when it appeared, I'd been reading about the way plagues had an impact on various junctures in history. So I hope it's a rather digressive answer to your question, but I think these thoughts then were so antagonistic to the ruling worldview at the time and the ruling mood at the time, which was one of boosterism. Remember, one thing I've learned is that if you have a view which everyone accepts as being the truth, and it promises good things and is also profitable, so if you talk to banks in those days, where I did a bit, and you say to them, as I did, China will not become a liberal state. Will not happen. Why will it not happen? Because, first of all, this is in the 90s. They looked at what happened in the Soviet Union. They're not going to repeat it. Secondly, it's a Leninist state, and the judicial system and the courts are all subject to the party. It's not going to change. Thirdly, every enterprise of any significance, and generally big enterprise, has party cadres implanted in it, which will have to be consulted at every point. They're not going to permit a revolution, and a liberal state could only come about in China by a revolution. So it's not going to happen. No one believed me. First of all, because it meant that the ruling worldview was false, which, while worldviews last, which is sometimes not very long, they're very contagious. Groupthink, herd thinking comes in. And secondly, it would have made them doubtful about the profits they were going to make. So when you have a conjunction of groupthink with the prospect of serious money being made, it's irresistible. So it goes on for as long as the profits seem to come in, or as long as the underlying geopolitical tensions don't become too obvious, which they now have. So now we're almost into a position where deglobalization has become a cliche. We're almost in a position in which everybody accepts that globalization, or which it is in many important respects, but not all. Does that answer your question?
It answers my question very well. And I think for younger listeners and viewers, people younger than, say, 25, they will find it almost impossible to believe quite how distinctive and sincerely held the ideology you just said was. If you said to somebody, no, I don't think China will actually get more liberal, they would say, well, of course it will have rising GDP, there'll be falling birth rate.
The bourgeoisie will emerge.
Pardon?
A bourgeoisie.
Yeah,
and the bourgeoisie, they would say, they could do with a bit of Marxism on this, has always been liberal. It hasn't always been liberal. The bourgeoisie in Europe in the mid-20th century backed fascism, not liberalism.
Yeah. Or
it's a complete historical myth.
Well, yeah, or you look at the rise of anarchism at the sort of turn of the 20th century, late 19th century, the guy that killed McKinley, these were basically small business owners. They were radicalized members of the petty bourgeois.
Yes, they were.
They were attracted to anarchism.
Yes.
The idea that they would fall in behind some sort of stolid, progressive bourgeois ideology.
Yeah.
Anyway.
The funniest point for me was in about 1989, 1990, when I would say, what's going to happen is that history will go on as usual. And people said, you're an apocalyptic pessimist. So if you say things are going to go on as normal, as they've always done, you're an apocalyptic pessimist. If you say they're going to change completely from what they've ever been, you're a realist. Now, when I was in Washington in the 89, 90, one of the things that happened then is that some of the big foundations that were backing foreign policy programs, the ones I knew were mostly on the right, pulled most or all of their money out.
So what's this, like the Atlantic Council, people like that?
I can't remember now.
But
I think my Heritage, all of those people, were getting the money. They either cut it down or cut it off because they said, it's not needed, we've won. And we haven't just won for 5 years or 10 years or even a generation. We've won forever. So the idea that, this was what Fukuyama calls capital letter history. Capital letter history, Hegelian history, Koyevian history. These were, that's to say, a certain idea, a certain conception of what it means to be recognized, to be seen as a human being, had become universal, or was in the process of becoming universal, or near universal, and nothing could stop that. But it could be accelerated so that what I didn't anticipate until it began to be clear around about 2001, 2002, I suppose, is that the people who believed this would want to accelerate this inevitable process by regime change. That's to say, you could say the whole world is changing on these lines. There might be a few holdouts, there might be a few Taliban, there might be a few nationalists here and there, but basically the whole world is accepting this idea, this big capital letter. But that's the way it's going to be. But if it's somewhat slower than we imagined, which by then, more than 10 years after the fall of the wall, it was become, we can accelerate it by not just one, but a succession of wars of choice. Now, by the way, I don't say they were the only reasons or the only people who were pushing for these wars. There were military bureaucrats in the Pentagon, some of them. There were supposedly hard men and women thinkers and so on, and tough guys of various kinds who, for their own reasons, wanted the war. But I don't think it would have happened. I was there a lot in those days. I don't think it would have happened without the neoconservatives. They created the background. There were other people who supported. It was a coalition of supporters of the war with different views.
What changed, though, with all of this? Because are you a fan of science fiction?
Yes.
Yeah. So you look at people like the Foundation series, or you look at Dune, published in the 50s in the United States.
Now a movie. It's 2 movies.
Yeah, great. Also just a great book, and it has such a firm grasp on what, the long span of history.
Yes.
How empires and enmity and all these primal things you're talking about, nations, religion.
Not only that, but Dune is much more interesting to me than Asimov or Star Wars because it's neo-feudal.
Well, precisely, but it's in the distant
Yeah, but
future.
it's the feudal future.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the
Which makes it a very modern book, right?
Yes. Well, a very 20th century or very 21st century or late 20th century book, because one of the features of the worldview, and this was common, I think, to Marxism as well as liberalism, but certainly of that worldview, was the idea of irreversible phases in history. If you'd gone through feudalism and into liberal capitalism, you could never go back. You can go back. Not exactly to feudalism, because that was, of course, an agrarian economy based on land, but you can go back to a set of social relations and political structures, which are very like feudalism. They're not quite feudalism. As you know, in my book, I discuss the arguments of some people in America who say we've got feudalism. It's not quite feudalism. In some ways, it's worse than feudalism, because in feudalism, tremendous corruption, wars of religion, so on and so forth, power of the church, censoring ideas, and so on. There are all those kind of features, but you couldn't actually easily, not many people until the early modern period when feudalism began to fray, not large numbers of people didn't fall out of the system altogether into free fall, which has happened in America. That's to say, you've got large numbers of people, hundreds of thousands or even millions, who are basically, apart from some bits of public welfare and charity and crime, have no position in society at all. That didn't happen. But in other respects, you can have, and according to some American critics of their own type of society, you do have neo-feudal relations. So I think what's interesting about science fiction, or the science fiction writers who did not accept an Asimov-like or a Star Wars-like view that these liberal ideas would spread not only all over the world, but all over the galaxy, all over these. They thought that previous social forms involving things like, loyalty is a big thing in Dune, is it not? Hierarchy. People are told what they can do and not do. Religion, or at least obligation, and shamanism of various kinds is there. Divination is there. Roman practice. They've reinvented. Even pre-feudal, it has Roman elements as well, in which divination and other practices were important. So I think they are. I think science fiction. I knew J.G. Ballard, who at one point in his life was a science fiction writer, who wrote other genres as well, of course. But I think science fiction of the best sort is a good lens to view the present.
The great thing with the Foundation series is, and like you say, there's almost two competing visions of how history works, Foundation and Dune, is that it offers an amazing snapshot at how people thought, this thing called, we now call it, in reflection, the Great Acceleration, permanently rising populations, ever greater.
Go on forever.
Yeah, because he talks about the population of this ginormous empire.
So that would be too big for the planet.
In the tens of billions and billions of billions of people, when in reality what we know is that in the 21st century, this planet's population will probably plateau at about 10 billion and then start to fall.
Yes.
But like you say, they were making inferences from the early 1800s.
It'll go from 10 billion to 100.
Yeah, and this will go on forever, where of course it didn't.
But there were two reasons they were wrong. The big expansion of population in human history was over 200 or 300 years, not 2,000 or 3,000 years. Let alone 30,000 years. It happened as a byproduct, I think, of hydrocarbons, of industrialization. So it's quite brief, quite brief, 300 years.
My grandmother. Sorry to interrupt. My grandmother. She died at 98. She was born in a world where there were 2 billion people.
Yeah.
She died this year. She died in a world where there are 8 billion people.
Yeah.
So that is incredible, right? The planet's population quadruples in the span of a person's life.
Yes.
Wow.
So their idea was that 200 or 300 years was a template for universal history forever after. Now, back to nature, things like that never happen in nature. You never have in the natural order of things. It all turns on the belief, which liberals have but never admit to. I never believe that nonsense. Liberals generally nowadays don't admit to ever having any of the beliefs they really do have, or that they've had in the past. It turns on the idea, which not only liberals but some Marxists as well have, that the human animal can humanize nature or transcend nature. They might say, well, this might have been true in the days of Malthus. It might have been true in the days of the Roman Empire. Plagues might have been important in ancient Rome and so on, but in a completely different perspective. What they didn't bring out was a feature I'd argued in rather rudimentary form, perhaps, in False Dawn, which is that the more integrated a global economy and a global civilization was, the more fragile it would be. Until I suppose the start of the 20th century, when you had a world flu epidemic, plagues weren't global because most of the human beings in the world lived in economies that were separate from each other. They didn't touch each other very much. And it's no accident that when you had big plagues in the ancient world, they were in Rome, which was an early experiment, if you like, in globalization and closely interconnected by trade. So they didn't take on board that either in history, in earlier periods of history, like the Roman period, or in the natural, the systems of nature, natural systems, growth of this exponential kind is never, full stop, never permanent. It always comes to some kind of stop.
I want to pick up on something you said, because this is really fascinating. And it was there's 2 or 3 insights in the book which just really hit me. One was this idea that, and we've said it many times on this show, we're reverting to a a genre of capitalism, a kind of political economy, which in some ways resembles feudalism. Gains in productivity only go to the top 1%. Increasingly, profits and revenues are generated through asset ownership, rentierism, etc., etc., etc. This is not new.
Arbitrage, not production.
Yeah, exactly. Value capture, not creation. Blah, blah, blah. People have been saying this for like 15 years. What you say is that actually, in some ways, the system we have now is worse than feudalism. Can you explain why? Because I think obviously most people would disagree with that.
Well, in one reason is the one I've already given you, but it's connected. And the one reason is that large parts of the formerly productive population in Western countries, particularly United States, have no productive role in the society. And since their identities, their communities, but also their medical care and their incomes depend on their role in the economy, they have nothing, basically. And one of the things they don't have is what people had in the feudal period. Of course, if you're a Marxist or a certain kind of liberal rationalist, you say that this is just an illusion that pacified them. Even though they knew the society around them was thoroughly corrupt, they still actually, I think, believed, the evidence is they believed that in the rationale of the society, which was that there was an afterlife in which injustices would be corrected. It might also be hierarchical afterlife, but it would be much better. By the way, the reason we know they believed this is that there were also radical and revolutionary millenarian movements in the Middle Ages, which said, we do believe this, but we don't accept the society. So the millenarians in the proto-communists, if you like, in the late medieval, early modern period, were not atheists, ever. They were eschatological Christians. That's to say, they believed these legitimating roles. Now, the difference now is that I think, and this is new, but it's something that young people can, I think, understand. No one really expects now, certainly no one's confident, and certainly no one thinks it's inevitable, but actually hardly anyone really expects the rest of their lives or their children's, if they have children, or their children's lives, to be better than theirs. That's a fundamental change. It's a really profound change, because the melioristic ideology of increasing material well-being interlocked with the progressive ideology that each stage of emancipation in society built on the previous one. So women get the vote, they're partially emancipated, still very unequal, but that can be remedied once that's happened. Prisoners can get basic rights, ethnic groups, the struggle against colonialism. It was a stadial theory. It was a theory of stages. And the assumption was that each stage that had been reached in the past would remain fixed, would remain there. Now, one of the features of the 20th century is that was disproved in Europe, because Europe in the interwar period saw tremendous conflicts of ideologies and ethnicities and so forth. And when the Nazis then came, they swept away not only, they achieved, it isn't that they went from some kind of level of staircase 3 back to staircase 2, they went to minus 20. Sweeping away enormous amounts of what had been achieved before, sweeping away even the good bits of the bourgeois civilization were swept away. But this is happening now as a common experience, and not in the context of catastrophic wars necessarily. The common experience now is that there'll be many young people who will say to you, I'll never be able to afford to own a house. I can't even afford to rent in London. If one room in London is now over £1,000 a month, one room, I just can't do it. And they don't see a point in the future where that will be different. So it's most acute, though. If you have some kind of a job, if you have some kind of education, if you live in a country where there are, however semi-collapsed, still some welfare institutions and NHS, and with all of its problems and others, then people can sink into a mood of resigned hedonism, which I think is a common response. But if you have nothing at all, if you live in a semi-collapsed or state of nature in a post-industrial part of the United States, where there is epidemic drug use, then you'll have what is now in fact happening, which is huge levels of early death, falling longevity. I think longevity in Mississippi is roughly that of Bangladesh.
Just building on what you said there, there's a great line in the book which, basically says religion historically was the opium of the masses, and now they're just being offered opium, fentanyl, OxyContin.
But before they were offered fentanyl, they were offered the future.
Precisely. So this is the typology I sort of just want to quickly offer. So like you say, feudalism, you have eschatological afterlife. Modernity, you have, like you said, the future. We're all temporarily embarrassed millionaires, the sort of American ideology. And now, like you say, we don't even have that. There is no future. So you have high inequality, potentially under all of these scenarios, personal income deprivation, suffering. But like you say, there is two big amelioratives in those first two categories: feudalism, 21st century capitalism, or let's say mid-20th century capitalism. And then now we have something quite distinct. And you also see this, I think, in the built environment. The built environment across much of the UK and the United States is just collapsing. It is collapsing.
Yes,
I think,
literally in many cases.
Yeah, it's a visible expression of giving up
agree with that.
on both faith and the future. We have buildings now built for 30, 40 years, which look like crap, don't really serve any purpose, and nobody thinks they'll be there, 3 or 4 decades from
And not
now.
only that, but they're becoming either toxic or fragile.
Yeah, with the cladding and the rack concrete.
Let's think of a period, though, in our history, one which I'm old enough to remember even, in which this was not the case. There was a period after the Second World War, not just in Britain, but in other Western countries, European countries and America, when the state assumed certain responsibilities for moderating inequality, mitigating suffering, and reinforcing social cohesion. They weren't, in other words, old Labour weren't anti-capitalists, but they wanted to restrain capitalism, and they thought it was necessary to do so. Why did they think that? Because many of them had lived through the 1930s. They were from a generation that had not only fought in the Second World War, so they knew what could happen when a social system had melted down, but even some of them were old enough to remember the tremendous meltdown of capitalism, which had triggered Nazism, which had triggered various fascist movements, or at least energized them. And so then after the Second World War, for maybe up to a generation, 30 years perhaps, mid-70s, there was a system in many European countries which was called social democracy, and I think had many achievements to its name. And so that was the kind of, it depended on an environment which began to change even as early as the late 70s, I would say. But an environment in which there were relatively closed economies, in which there wasn't much globalization. It only really began to get going in China and elsewhere. The market reforms began to get going in late 70s. But for 30 years, there was a more restrained form of capitalism based on what? Based on the perception, the experience, not just the theory, that capitalist economies can go badly wrong. When they go badly wrong, they can be really badly wrong, and that can have terrible political repercussions, including fascism. That was common sense, and it was well-founded common sense among the old Labour people. That was then, that insight was then lost in the 80s and after the 80s. Well, let me give you again maybe an anecdote. I came from a northeastern working class background, and in the first part of my life in the 50s, Britain was still poor. After the Second World War, it was still a poor country. And yet, NHS doctors came out if you had a cold, a flu. I remember them coming to my house. Unthinkable now, even before the pandemic, that anyone would come out for anything short of a major emergency. And yet, we are richer even now. We might be getting poorer now, actually, but we have been richer. What changed? What changed was the global environment of capitalism and the dominant beliefs about the state and about what the state should do and not do. And this has produced in Britain a tremendous confusion. So part of the confusion was that when Brexit became an issue, most of the Brexiters in the run-up to 2016 thought that Brexit was a window to further globalization, to an even smaller state. Most of the people who voted for it did not share that view.
No, of course not.
Yeah, but that's created, I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Brexit project has been aborted and botched.
Let's return to Brexit in a second, but I just want to stick on this. So you say that
there was a period.
And these people weren't anti-capitalist. So what I would say to that is, and that's obviously correct, is that those people today would be classified as anti-capitalist. So if you say, and this is, there's a great talk by Eric X. Lee about the Chinese Communist Party, and it's a TED talk, and he said elsewhere that we still believe in markets in China. We still, there's still money making money, ergo capital. The big difference is that those who make political decisions don't view the interests of capital as superseding the national interest or the public good. That's what he says. So the interests of capital aren't the sort of political summum bonum.
Although let's never forget that the power of workers to resist capital in China is even less than it is in India.
Absolutely.
Much less.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting.
There are no trade unions for a start.
No, absolutely. I'm not sort of.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting insight, which is to say that China has markets. China is deeply embedded in global sort of production, commodity chains, yada yada yada. What is different? Because clearly there are differences in terms of the sort of political decisions.
Well, the difference I say in the book is, and this is maybe
because I want to stick with this.
Yeah.
Because I think what he's saying about the public good, about certain values taking priority over the interests of capital, I think that broadly applied to European social democracies from 45 to the late 1970s. And so I think...
And even earlier, because in that article you wrote about Boots.
Yeah, exactly. But if you said that now...
The capitalists themselves accepted limitations on what they could do.
But if you're a politician now and you say there should be limits on what capital can do, where it can go, what it can buy, that is viewed by...
As anti-capitalist.
Yes. So Ernest Bevan would be an anti-capitalist for the lobbyists and news people of 2023, even though he obviously never was.
Yeah. And Peter Shaw would be anti-capitalist. And Hugh Gaitskell would be anti-capitalist.
Quite.
Well, this is one of the absurdities of presentism. That one of the features of intellectual and public life now is that what went before even 20 years before, soon it'll be 5 years, maybe it'll be 5 minutes, it's just vanished, it's just erased. So if you'd say, well, you can go to a library, there are still libraries, you can look up on the internet, you can buy books on Amazon, they're still there, and books and so on, written by these people, where they criticize many aspects of capitalism, that would now lead them to be viewed as almost revolutionaries, anti-capitalists, but were then normal moderate opinion. So we get all this utter nonsense about centrism. Centrism means a kind of a collation of policies, none of which are popular, many of which are radically rejected by most of the population, but they're attenuated and triangulated to the point in which it's thought that they can be put over on the population. That's what centrism is. Most of the centrist ideas, are extremely unpopular, rejected by large parts of the population. Most of the British population, for example, favours, as I do, but I think it's not going to happen, it's not possible, favours nationalisation, taking back into some form of public ownership most of the utilities. Obviously water, large parts of energy, maybe parts of the banks, railways and so on. That would be a very good move. And if you check even conservative voters, well over half, sometimes 60-70%, yeah, very good idea. Why don't we do it? It's an extremist idea now. Well, then you've got to, it's represented as an extremist idea. Now, there are reasons why it might not be possible, including some I've talked about in some of my recent, it might not be possible because Britain is very highly exposed to international capital flows. So if these policies were done in a way which the markets perceived to be dangerous to the financial system, the markets would veto it. So it might be that it is impossible. But there's nothing extreme about them. They were the common bread and butter of British politics from, at least from the Second World War, before that, of course, as well, but from the government of 1945 up to, even I would say periods of Thatcherism, because as I mentioned in my book, she had these rather charming inconsistencies. We can never privatize the post office because the Queen's head is on the stamps.
Yeah.
Now, that was actually a deep thing. she didn't grasp the way in which liberated markets dissolve the culture around them, including the national culture. She strongly opposed, I think BA, as British Airways, changed the logo on the back of the plane and took the flag off. She strongly opposed it. Couldn't understand that BA was now a global capitalist entity.
She should have read some Marx about how capital, about how markets can dissolve, previous traditions. There's all in the Communist Manifesto. Obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, that was where Marx was right. It was prophetic. But she wouldn't have done that. But in her favor, she also, and this is in False Dawn, she responded to an account of Fukuyama's ideas, saying, end of history, beginning of nonsense. Didn't believe any of that rubbish. She saw the kind of bourgeois society, basically an idealized model of the 1950s, actually, or even the 30s. She saw that as something that required political struggle. She thought it could be revived. The paradox was, and this is what she was sort of skewered on, this paradox, and the deepest paradoxes are the ones that the people involved in them never understand, was that what she did in the economy destroyed all possibility and even then all memory of the society she wanted to rebuild. That's the deep paradox of Thatcherism, which I began to understand myself maybe from about 87 to 88 and onwards. And that was when I adopted a slightly Bucharanist role of making cryptic criticisms of all this, very unwelcome criticisms. I didn't end up in a camp or something or a cell like Bucharan, but they were very, very unwelcome. And when she was still in power, although she never embraced Fukuyama's theory, her own view of the world and that of many Thatcherites had become a form of universal triumphalism, a kind of upside-down Marxism. And what I'd objected to in Marxism, you might not take this view, but is what I object to in all radical progressive ideologies, which is the contempt they display for the casualties of progress. You say, well, but 4 million, 10 million Russian peasants died. Well, they were peasants. People, what cultivated? Did they have degrees? Were they graduates?
I suppose the left response would be, well, precisely all of this happens with regards to the formation of markets in the whole world, right? Or the Irish famine. The Irish famine, for instance, is the exact same phenomenon. So I suppose a reasonable, I hope, left response would be, that's absolutely correct. The point is that market ideologues don't understand they did the exact same thing.
No, they don't. And but that, when there had been moderate forms of capitalism, that was understandable. But when a more radical form of capitalism was reinvented or invented a new form even, actually, because it was more global than it ever been before, even in the colonial period, it was more global than that. There was this, to me, very repellent, morally repellent, even aesthetically repellent, view that if there are groups that can't fit into this well, let them go.
Yeah.
And so they would go by living in broken down cities. They gradually, some would leave, some would die, some would have short lives. And this is on a bigger scale happening in America, where, of course, as we've discussed earlier in our conversation today, Aaron, there are these really large numbers of deaths from drugs. Of course, you can look at it another way. You could say, drugs are the hyper-capitalist commodity. It's interesting, but if you many of the big series in television and series in the last few years coming out of America have been about ordinary people, middle-class people and other people entering the drug economy. Breaking Bad. But lots of them have been like that.
Ozark. Great TV.
Great TV. But it also tells you something, which is that the only way for many people to either live a normal life, which in Breaking Bad meant funding cancer care, or to accumulate substantial capital, is the drug economy. Large parts of America are now such that the living parts of the economy are the drug economy and its various extensions, because, of course, it then funds legitimate businesses and gains hold of them. So that's a very interesting feature, I think, of, and that connects with our earlier discussion of feudalism. I mean, I think however much one criticizes the feudal lords and aristocrats, which I would myself in many ways, they weren't as cruel or as anarchical as Mexican or Colombian or Russian cartels. I mean, they're extraordinarily cruel. They're extraordinarily violent and kill enormous numbers of people. And yet there are large parts of Latin America and other countries that have fallen into that condition. And that connects, by the way, with another feature of my book, which is very much resisted and might even be resisted by Hobbes if he could be brought back, which is that one of the ways in which I represent Hobbes as a liberal rationalist and a liberal optimist is that he did think that his ideas were, which they are in some respects universal, but he did think that they could be applied to get societies that had fallen into what he called a state of nature. That's warring groups, warring over position and power and resources. They could get out of that by inventing a sovereign by a sort of contract. I don't think history supports that. I think there are lots of periods in history which show that states of nature in society. State of nature is not something in Hobbes before society is formed. It's a condition that societies can fall into at any time. They last for ages, centuries, even. It's very hard to get out of a situation like that. And that was something also, by the way, which the liberals of the Iraq War and of the Libyan regime change didn't understand, which is that it's comparatively easy to destroy a state. It's extremely difficult to recreate it. In Libya, for example, I mean, one of the features of current life now is that Libya doesn't just have two governments, which in practice means it hasn't got any government, but it's also one of the really principal gateways of illegal migration into Europe. So that problem was, or that reality, that flow was created by or magnified by the regime change that Cameron and the French imposed on Libya. I mean, when people say you've got to stamp down on the gangs and you've got to repress the people traffickers, well, that might be possible to do in Europe where there are still relatively strong states. You can't do it in Libya because there is no state. So it just can't be done.
Yeah, this is
in there. So that's connected. On how many occasions have you watched reports about Lampedusa or other migration flows, big migration flows? How many times, when they mention that some of them have come from Libya, how often has it been mentioned that the Libyan state was destroyed by Western intervention? I would say practically never. And that's not deliberate, by the way. It's not a conspiracy, which we're not going to mention this. Most people first of all, they've never heard, they're too young, or they don't know anything about it. They don't care. The rapid business of generating news doesn't permit that kind of reflection. It just isn't in the range of thoughts and experiences and histories that people know.
I mean, this to me seems like a core small c conservative insight, as somebody who's a socialist that agrees with like this insight, which is, like you say, it's very, very easy comparatively to destroy a state infrastructure. It's very hard to build it. And Libya is really the great example here, because I tweeted this, I think, earlier on in the week with regards to these floods. Tens of thousands of people dying, open air slave markets.
Yes,
like you say,
absolutely
astonishing stuff. And I say clearly Gaddafi was better. Clearly, Human Development Index. I think in 2010 they were like 55th in the world, number 1 in Africa. Now they're 115th. Just Human Development Index is literally like.
And some of this is measurable. A lot of it is.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So clearly, you'd want to. You'd probably want to go back in time if you were Libyan. And then but some people say, well, yeah, but he was going to get Benghazi. So Benghazi is now run by basically a form of the Taliban. I don't think they recognize quite what they've unleashed.
Well, there's a reason for that, though. It's part of the liberal worldview, which is that nothing can be worse than tyranny. But lots of things are worse than tyranny. I mean, some tyrannies differ. There can be tyrannies that are limited in their goals. To enriching a few people. And though that might be terrible, and it can be less humanly costly than tyrannies which want to change the whole of society according to some model, which could be communist or fascist. So there can be different kinds of tyrannies. But it simply isn't true that on any reasonable ethical or empirical assessment, that tyrannies are always the worst thing.
Where do you think it ends? Because, we've seen so many of these mistakes, like I say, with Libya, Afghanistan.
After it was said by nearly everybody, this will never happen again.
Yeah.
It did happen.
But people still defend it. That's the thing. That's what I find really, really interesting.
Well, they say that it's because they say tyranny is the worst thing. They still believe that. And they don't see the necessity. Well, there's maybe an even deeper reason, which wouldn't fit in easily to most aspects of left-wing thought, which is that much of political life, as of much of ethical life, is a choice in which involves options and choices in which whatever is done involves irreparable loss or even wrong, even injustice. That's very sort of, in other words, if you think that, then it's not just a choice between evils, because you could say, well, choice between evils, we'll maximize the good and minimize the evil, which is a kind of utilitarian way of thinking. So in a sense, the evils don't matter. If you get the maximum out of it, the evils don't matter. But I don't think that's true to human experience. Human experience is of choosing between options, recurring options that don't go away. They keep recurring in different forms, in which whatever is done involves what those who have acted or failed to act recognize to be irreparable losses. I'll tell you an example from that in the Second World War, which was told me by Isaiah Berlin, which was that a government officer, government official appeared, or a minister, even, I can't remember now, appeared before his typing pool and said, we're going to sack every single person in the typing pool, which would be a great injustice to all but one of you, because not only will you be sacked, you'll never get a job again. There'll be a black mark over your security because you're sacked for security reasons. One of you is leaking, but we don't know who that is, and we haven't got time to find out. And in the meantime, brave men and women are being dropped into parts of the enemy territory and dying terrible deaths. Terrible deaths. So we're sacking a lot of you. And he sacked them all. Now, the interesting thing about that is, to me, is that he recognized that what he was doing involved injustice and wrong, not just a utilitarian calculation. He didn't turn it into utilities and say it'll be more utiles, it'll be more pleasure and less pain in the world. It was a deep injustice to those who suffered it. Their lives were effectively, their productive lives were ruined permanently and irreparably ruined. Even after the war, they'd never get a job in this again. But for the sake of a goal, winning the war, and also protecting these people who are going out there to be tortured to death and so on, and betrayed. Now, a basic question for ethics and political theory is, will there ever be a point in the human world where this is to be true? Now, if you're a certain kind of progressive, a certain kind of Marxist, and a certain kind, there won't be, in my view. There won't be. It'll always be like this. Why it'll be like this? Because that's what human beings are like. We have conflicting needs, conflicting impulses, even if we had material abundance, it would appear in these. So, but that's something which many people are extremely resistant. It's an idea which to them is deeply pessimistic. Although you can turn around and you can say that in times of tragic choices, they also are periods and contexts where people can display extraordinary nobility.
See,
they can take on the irreparable loss to themselves, even.
I agree with what you've just said there, and I say this as somebody who wrote a book about moving to a society beyond capitalism and of a kind of abundance we're not really familiar with. I agree with what you've just said, and I would say in response that human frailties and all the kinds of discontent you just talked about will never go away. And in fact, some people have already lived under conditions of comparative post-scarcity and abundance. We call them the aristocracy. And if you read the sort of novels like Laclos and these kinds of people...
How they lived.
Yeah, how they lived. They're often very sad, very tragic. So there's big parts of their lives which don't, of human experience which won't disappear.
And competitive as well.
Yeah, or quite. But then I suppose the question is, what's a bigger problem? People are getting upset about love affairs or, the paradox of choice, or not being able to feed themselves or dying from diphtheria. But I'm making an extreme comparison there. But I think you're absolutely right about certain aspects of these things never...
But for many people, it's a hard choice to... it's a hard truth, I would say. It's a fact. It's a fact of ethical life. It's that there are these recurring situations. And even in it, you see, the paradox emerges for revolutionaries in that in an attempt to create a world in which these tragic choices don't need to be made, or they only occur in personal life with love affairs and friendships and so on. The revolutionaries find themselves with precisely having to make the decisions and the choices that they want to abolish. So one of the things that's not understood, as you know, a lot of my book is about Russia, and I don't deal with this part in Russia. One of the reasons that a post-Tsarist Russia turned into a Bolshevik state, and one of the reasons that was highly repressive, was partly Western intervention and partly the struggle with the whites. But one of the things that happens in all revolutionary situations is that the revolutionaries struggle among themselves, and the ones that are the least ruthless, like the Russian anarchists, are the ones that are eliminated, exterminated either physically or politically marginalized. So that the paradox of revolutionary action, and of all political action in my view, even conventional political action, is that if it's motivated by these grandiose ideas of getting to a world in which tragic choices don't exist, it will find itself making these choices in order to achieve the world in which they don't exist. So perpetuating the world in which it does. And I think that's, you see, this is maybe an irreconcilable, I mean, left-wing thinkers and conservative thinkers agree on more than real left-wing thinkers and real conservative thinkers. I don't mean neoliberals on either side. Agree on more than either usually realize. But there's a fundamental difference between the view that I take and many people on the left take, and even on the right, of course, the neoliberal right. If you would say to them, they would say exactly in a way what you say. They say, well, we may get it to a world where the people have to make choices among ethnic cuisines. They may get to a world in which, I don't know how it could be tragic to choose between Indian and Chinese, but anyway, we may have a world in which people have unhappy love affairs. They do have unhappy love affairs. And we may have a world in which people suddenly die of new diseases and so on. So that might be, but we won't have a world in which the structures of power are such that they impose these choices, tragic choices on large numbers of people.
So I suppose there's two. Having read your corpus, read this book, there's probably 2 points of disagreement or interesting conflict and tension. So the first is you've got a quite justified and understandable contempt, critique of utopianism. I would say the major problem for the West in the 21st century
was the lack of utopianism.
Is anti-utopianism. Because what it does, and you sort of talk about this a little bit in the book, but they don't say explicitly, is that, well, okay, living standards have been flat for a long time, productivity flat for 15 years, yet we really can't get a handle on any one of about a dozen social challenges that working and middle-class people really care about. But you know what? You're not a peasant living in 15th century France, so stop complaining. So I think there's a toolkit for intellectuals and politicians, which I think was very well suited to the problems of the 20th century. But I think this aversion, skepticism, hostility to utopianism is increasingly constraining the ability of the West to solve its basic problems.
No, I would think it's slightly different than that. I mean, the difference is that liberal capitalists don't understand the respects in which they view as utopian. They don't understand the respects in which it can't be made global or universal. The more it extends itself, the more fragile it becomes. And they think of it as permanent when there can be a boom, of course, a boom period. There have been many boom periods in history. That can last for a while. But they have the seeds in them of their own destruction. So when they say, I mean, this is, if you like, the problem with what's come to be called capitalist realism, which is it assumes the situation, it assumes the system can be indefinitely malleable and indefinitely managed. So this is a form of the end of history. Capitalist realism is a form of the end of history. So you could say, well, what about the Wall Street crash? Well, that will never be allowed to happen again. What about the rise of fascism in the 30s? Well, that's not going to happen. It is happening actually under various forms now. But so, by the way, we can be sure it's possible if it's actually happening. One little piece of logic you can get out of philosophy is if something's actually happening, then it's definitely possible. But they say no, we can manage the system. We can keep it going. Now that might not always be a bad position to take if the alternatives are very much worse. So if you're saying to me, supposing I was in Weimar, Germany, and before I was born, and there was a program, someone came up with a program that would somehow have stabilized Weimar, Germany. Difficult given what was happening in the world and so on, and given the conflicts in Central Europe and other, impossible probably actually. But would I have supported? Yes, I would have supported. It could even be thought of as a conservative program or a conservative sort. But I would have, because if I'd had any insight at that time, which some people I think did actually think how bad it could be, they didn't quite anticipate the full horrors of Nazism, but they thought it could be pretty bad, including people on the left. If you could say, well, would I support a so to speak a conservative strategy? Then yes, definitely. But the argument then would be, well, no, that's too. It's too. I mean, maybe I'm putting these arguments into your mouth, but you could say, but that assumes there's no alternative at all, or that all the alternatives are disastrous. There could be better alternatives. That's what the
Well, I think so. For instance, you said that you support public ownership of, let's say something really uncontroversial, rail, because the franchises end. It's very easy to.
Water's even less controversial.
Yeah, these are all quite moderately easy to execute, right? And I think for some people that would be viewed as utopian. And I think what this feeds into is the anti-utopianism as the default.
It might. I don't think you see.
They don't recognise the primacy of politics. So, for instance, they would say, "Well, the shareholders are not. No, they won't have that, and the banks and this." And that's what they didn't get about Brexit, is the primacy of politics. If you have a social majority wanting something very passionately in a system where people, in order to be re-elected, have to broadly do what people tell them to do, then that's broadly...
There's a difference here,
That's the direction in terms of the outcome.
There's a difference. Something can be utopian in the sense that it involves a system that has never existed or has never worked.
But we live in a world where people think that public ownership of rail is utopian. That's what these people think. We're not in a world where it's like Saint-Simon and Fourier, the seas turn to lemonade. They think public ownership of energy is utopian.
Now, yes, but it may be impossible without being utopian. Again, we know it's not utopian in the sense of being impossible because it did exist.
Yeah.
It's a repetition of what I said. If something did exist, it's not impossible. Again,
but their argument against it is by deploying anti-utopianism. Well, if we do that, then we don't know where it'll... Any politics which is infused...
The really hard truth is that what I would prefer in regard to public utilities is desirable and certainly possible because it existed before, but may well not be possible for any British government of any complexion as long as it remains as dependent on capital markets as it is.
And that's probably right, yeah.
Yeah, that's the hard truth.
Yeah.
In other words, it is desirable, it is possible, it did occur before, it could in principle occur again, so it's not utopian in that sense, not utopian, but it's also impossible for the foreseeable future. As long as we're as exposed, as long as I've argued, perhaps, it was not entirely frivolous when I compared Britain in the piece I did in my column to Argentina. One of the richest countries in the world, top 10 rich countries 100 years ago, went from being in that position in the 30s and then later to becoming a basket case. Such that it's actually such that now the various products of the Argentine political culture include radical anarcho-capitalists by their own description who want to burn down the central bank. They want to abolish the national currency and replace it by a mixture of dollars and crypto. They want free markets in sex and also human organs, but they're strongly anti-abortion. I haven't quite worked out how that works, but anyway, that's what some of they are. Millet, the front runner for the presidency, who could, by the way, I think there's a non-trivial chance that he could be elected. Could become. What would he do then? That'd be the interesting thing. But probably, I have been to Argentina. It was a long time ago, so I don't know what it's like now. But the hard truth is that certain social and political systems get themselves into a historical cul-de-sac from which it's very difficult to get out because their own politicians are thoroughly corrupt, thoroughly irresponsible, and the global capital markets will veto anything that could be done anyway, probably. So the really bad prospect for Britain which I think is not at all unrealistic. I don't say it's inevitable, but it's not at all unrealistic, is that we're actually either already or we're entering that position. And this takes us on to Brexit because, of course, what people say, well, we wouldn't be as isolated if we were in the magnificent colossus of Europe. That eternal thing, by the way. I mean, one of the odd things about the EU is that it's almost like a line from Eliot, T.S. Eliot. He talks about the still point of a turning world in one of his mystical poems. That's what the EU is for the Remainer mind. I don't mean all of those people who voted Remain. Lots of my friends voted Remain. By the way, the best argument against Brexit I've heard was one put to me by a friend who said, why are you voting Remain? He said, because the British political class simply isn't up to making Brexit. They're just hopeless.
It's a very good argument.
Very powerful argument. That's the best, I think, the best argument. And it's proved to be true. They weren't up to it. And they didn't want to. The political class didn't want to do it. It was handed to them, and they didn't do it. They thought that they tried to overturn it for several years. Then they accepted it. But even now they didn't accept it. Basically, they still want to reverse it, as has been seen recently in Starmer's revelation of the fact that he does have one belief, one feature. He has the belief in Europe, in the EU, the still point in the eternal. If we're in there, nothing bad can happen to us. Nothing bad can happen to Europe. Well, one thing's already bad that happens is Ukraine. That's kind of pretty bad. But also, many European countries now, for various reasons, partly connected with immigration, partly connected with climate policy and other factors, have seen a continuing trend, not just a blip, of the emergence of far-right parties. So we're not that way far off a situation in which the EU will be predominantly a far-right bloc. Now, you would think, wouldn't you, if the attitude of British Remainers to Europe was empirical and not mystical, you would think that they would take note of this and say, well, do we really want to be part of we rejoin or in some looser relationship, but still much closer than we are now, to a bloc in which many governments are dependent on far-right support, in which we're probably include 20% of the vote in Germany is far-right. Over 40% of, I think if I remember my figures right, of the French electorate in the last presidential election voted for Le Pen. Do we want to be a part of that? No, they don't say that. They never discuss the matter because as you and I think, but they're not really interested in Europe. Brexit for them was a fetid intra-Tory dispute where they wanted to. They know nothing about Europe and they don't care about Europe, but it does embody a kind of semi-mystical ideal for them in which we can escape the problems which are singular to Britain by merging with this other entity which has all the virtues that we lack. And it forms, and this is the crucial thing about their resistance to empirical thinking, which is that this is part of a worldview of those, which is that all of the experiences since 2016 are departures from the normal course of history. What they cannot and will never understand is that what they and other liberals call populism is political blowback against the social disruption that their policies have produced. They can't understand the connection between what they've done and populism. Populism comes from nowhere or from very evil people. What they come up with in the end is a theory of evil. Well, there are these evil demagogues who've been lying around for a long time, and they suddenly emerge and they deceive the gullible masses, the uneducated. That's what it is. It's a theory of evil. It's odd from those who say there isn't such a thing as evil, there's only error, human beings are indefinitely improvable, they're getting better. But they've come up with a theory, that explains it. But whatever the explanation they might come up with, 2016 onwards, or even before that, is an anomaly in the normal course of human history. The normal course of human history would have seen Hillary Clinton re-elected. Why didn't that happen? The Russians. It's usually something exogenous to the society, or some mistake that could easily have been altered but wasn't. Or remember at the time they said, well, Trump hasn't got a majority. They never said that about previously. I mean, he had a majority. It's an entire worldview which is on the line for them, and it's on the line for them partly, of course, because they are the vanguard of the normal course of history. I mean, the normal course of history was that it would be, which was dislocated or derailed from 2016 onwards, it would be that a transnational, potentially global, but at least European state, which wasn't an empire, but wasn't a nation state either. It's not an empire, but it isn't a nation. It's some new, completely new.
And it wants to go all the way to Georgia, but it's definitely not an empire.
Yeah, but also it hasn't got most of the. It's where I disagree with some of the Brexit. They say it's an incipient superstate. It isn't an incipient superstate. It hasn't got fiscal union. It hasn't got armed forces. At the moment, some people on the right of European politics are asking that a naval blockade be put around Lampedusa. It hasn't got a navy. Small problem. So it isn't a state. It's not going to become a state, in my view. There is an argument, I mean, some kind of ultra-sophisticated ex-Brexiteers now say, well, by leaving it, we've made them more likely. Some Remainers say, there's two people, we've made it more likely for Europe to become a dangerous superstate. Absolute nonsense. There are too many conflicts within Europe and too many problems that Europe can't resolve. There are conflicts between Poland and Hungary on the one hand, and even between them, but on the one hand, and the Germany and France on the other. Then there's the Baltic states. Then there's Scandinavia, Sweden. These are all have different interests and different trajectories. But also, in many of the states, as I mentioned earlier, the far right which is emerging is not a pan-European far right. These are not the fascists and Nazis of the 30s who wanted to abolish nations. Actually, some of them did. Some of them were pan-European. They were fed up with these particularly small ones. Get rid of them, kill them all, enslave them. They're not this. They're nationalists. So actually, the strong, the emerging far-right groups are primarily, they may or may not be proposing to leave the EU, which Le Pen doesn't anymore. And because actually the obstacles to leaving, if you're in the euro, are huge. Mm. We were able to leave when we did leave just because we weren't in the euro. But if you're in, it's a revolutionary act. And a revolution of that kind, which would probably involve in Italy and in France, for example, a devaluation of savings of those who had them, and 20, 30, 40%. You're not going to get bourgeois support for that. The only people who will want it will be impoverished young people. Another feature, by the way, of this is that these right-wing movements in Europe are very often youth movements.
Yeah. Very much lost on English speakers,
right? Oh, they don't understand.
So different.
They think that young people are all liberals, and not in Europe and not in America now. I mean, the conversion rate into far right positions is high, very high among young people.
Amongst like the cohort below Gen Z is particularly concerning, actually not concerning. But there's and what's interesting is if you look at, I think, people now entering college, 18 to 21-year-olds, there is this extraordinary divergence in political sympathies by gender in the US, which is just, obviously that's always existed to some extent.
Yes, that's a difference.
But now it's blown up in the last 5 years.
It's partly for a reason which I write about in the book, which is back in the early 90s, when I first got the idea that America might come a cropper because of its internal divisions.
When you say a cropper, what do you mean, civil war?
Not civil war, no. Could be civil warfare, which is chronic sort of low-level violence and disruption of institutions, but was partly because of abortion. America's different, not different from everywhere. There's also been conflicts in Poland and some European countries. But America is, because of its religious composition and others, and that spills over into a gender politics. And it's one of the reasons that DeSantis, I think, never really had a chance. Because unlike Trump, who could flirt with the pro-life wife, but doesn't believe any of it, and everybody knows he doesn't believe any of it, DeSantis really did. So he really would have pushed, I think, for, and I think that would have killed Republican support among many Republican women. Killed it stone dead. They don't want to lose this freedom. Why should they? They may not find the present situation satisfactory in many ways, and because one of the reasons I argued this back in the 1890s is that turning values into rights works when the values are broadly and generally accepted in society, and that's what. So you can have a right against torture, you can have a right various rights of free speech and so on, though defining them is not always easy. But if a position is turned, if a value position is turned into a right, which is deeply controversial in the society, which is deeply disputed and conflicted, as abortion always has been in America, then in the long run, and it may take, as it did take, 30 years for this to happen. Back then, what I wrote was the inevitable result is that the Supreme Constitutional Authority will become an object of political capture. If it constitutionalizes rights to activities that a third or a quarter of the population regard as basically wrong, in the long run, which has taken a generation, there will be a pushback by the Conservatives, and that was achieved under Trump. That was to appoint these conservative judges who had various complex constitutional arguments why abortion should never have been turned into a right. But all of those are irrelevant to me. They're just local American fetishes about constitutionalism. But the real reason is that rights cannot insulate from politics cultural and other conflicts which are deep-seated. If you try to do that, you eventually threaten the regime.
But this is very relevant to UK context because
Yes.
we, of course, now have a Supreme Court.
Yes, we do.
Which is very alien to
It's an American imposition.
Yeah, and
that was Blair.
Yeah, well, I love talking to conservatives about this because I say, look, well, if we had Lord Derriere, then the courts wouldn't be in this mess, sentencing wouldn't
Absolutely.
be like the police. This would not be anything like this. And I think there's probably something to that. But what's interesting with Blair is when he introduces the Supreme Court, I don't think he realises the gravity of what he's doing.
No, he didn't. He definitely.
You're changing the complexion of the democracy quite fundamentally.
Radically. Well, I agree with that 100%, Aaron, because what it's done is it's produced a kind of, the American system has produced its pathologies, which is that everything is litigated. It's part.
And if you capture this one body, you control the,
controls everything. Yeah. But everything is litigated, and law becomes a surrogate for politics. But when law becomes a surrogate for politics, law becomes politicized, and eventually that politics becomes Schmittian politics, the politics of enemies, which has happened now in America. That's one endpoint of that. Now we are in a kind of halfway house here, which is that lawfare was promoted by the Remainers, but it now covers vast swathes of government activity to the point at which it's even questionable whether we have a government actually in because you say, well, we should do this. You say, well, yes, but you'll have to. this would be a good thing to do. There might even be agreement, but it'll be litigated, stopped for years. We should build more houses. I'm not saying whether we should or we shouldn't, but build more houses. Well, you can't do that because it'll be endlessly litigated through the courts by the NIMBYs. And in that circumstance, what it produces in Britain is not not so much the Schmittian politics of enmity, but paralysis, in which nothing can actually be done on a wide range of issues, unless you're ready to get out of the the European Convention of Human Rights, which a few conservatives and others are. Anything that's done about immigration will be litigated, whether you agree with it or not. Anything, and many other issues. Issues of town planning and of building, and so it applies to them all. So what we've got in Britain is a kind of paralyzing version of lawfare, and it does, I think, emerge primarily, or at least the starting point of it was Blair's creation. The very name tells you what he was doing. He was trying to sort of superimpose on a fundamentally different system of parliamentary sovereignty. Let me go history of ideas. I used to be a historian of ideas, and I spent 20 years working and reading about John Stuart Mill. When John Stuart Mill writes about liberty, his background idea is not a court. There wasn't a Supreme Court. There was parliamentary sovereignty, which was pretty well absolute. By the way, it was absolute up to and including Thatcher. She could do whatever she wanted.
Feasibly, it's still here, right? They could scrap the Supreme Court if there was an act of Parliament to get rid of the Supreme Court.
Legally, it could all still be scrapped, but there's not the political will there, and there won't be.
Well, I think I'm sort of surprised the Tories never talk about that.
Oh, they have been talking about the European Convention.
But I mean, the Supreme Court bit in this, because that's lower hanging fruit, right?
It would be semi-revolutionary. I mean, in a sense, again, look what's happening in Israel. Similar in some respects to us, in that there isn't a fixed constitution, there isn't a written constitution. The attempt by Netanyahu to limit, not abolish the Supreme Court, produced profound internal divisions. I also followed, and I even went there on some occasions. I followed the evolution of political development in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand was interesting because its original constitution was an extreme version of the British constitution, which is that there were no set rights, there was no Supreme Court. When I went in the early 90s, late 80s, there was no second chamber. It was a billiard hall, at least when I visited them. And I think the second chamber was abolished there in the 1950s. So there was one parliament which could do anything. And that was why, by the way, that was the reason, the basic fundamental constitutional political reason, why neoliberalism there was more radical than anywhere else. It's the only country of which I'm aware in which farming was marketized, radically marketized. So they usually powerful. You can do all sorts of things about farm, but to actually just defund them completely, which they did, almost unthinkable. And it all happened rather quickly. There were local reasons for that, which is that their Labour Party was taken over by someone with strong neoliberal views, but a somewhat left-wing foreign policy. And that led the left to think that none of this was going to happen. Whereas it's obvious to me that it was going to happen. But it was also obvious to me that it would melt down for various reasons, because they started talking about changing the electoral system, which they did. And then the party constellation of parties all changed. So most of what had been done was kept, but some of the more extreme edges of their Thatcherism were sort of made a bit more bearable. But you're absolutely right about this. I think Blair didn't grasp what a fundamental change was, or maybe he did, but he thought it would be coherent. He didn't understand that underneath there'd still be parliament, there'd still be local authorities, and they would be political bodies. And then you superimpose this structure of law going up to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court still can't overrule Parliament if Parliament comes up with a decision which as to what it wants, but the political will is absent. In practice, what that means is my political hope, insofar as I still have any, is for a hung Parliament, which may not happen either. There may not be a hung Parliament because of what's happened in Scotland. The meltdown of the SNP may give Labour a working majority, in which case there will not be proportional representation. I've now come to the view, which I opposed for many, many, many years, but I pride myself on being something of an empiricist, so I've come to this view from observations and evidence, that electoral reform is a precondition of any kind of emergence of better political ideas and better political coalitions in Britain. And the reason I came to that is that the principal argument against proportional representation that I know is that it doesn't produce strong government, but we've had governments with massive majorities that have been weak, very weak, been locked in internal 80 majority, produced chaos and anarchy and various kinds of internal party conflict and division, and achieved nothing, basically. So having that experience and seeing all the parties converging on the non-existent centre, that strange confluence of watered-down policies, all of which are opposed by the British majority. And the only way that can be broken up is by changing the electoral system. And I think that is possible. There may yet be a hung Parliament. And if there isn't a hung Parliament this time, there may be after that. Because one thing I would confidently make a prediction. Many other things. It's not clear who's going to win the American election. It's not clear whether Biden will be around. It's not clear what's going to happen. But in Britain, I'm pretty confident Labour will be overwhelmed quite quickly if it becomes the government. Because it has nothing, essentially. Its only policies are a green agenda, which is not affordable and which imposes disproportionate costs on working people. So will be rejected by the trade unions, and already is being to some extent. And a pro-European policy, which is anachronistic and nostalgist. It won't occur, probably, something like that probably won't occur because it would be difficult to legitimate democratically in Britain any really transformative re-engagement with Europe. So it's a cul-de-sac that they're moving into. That will break down and then something else will happen.
It's interesting about the parliamentary sovereignty bit, because Ramsay MacDonald said this in the early 20th century, which is, we don't need to do what the Bolsheviks have done in Russia. We have a sovereign parliament which gives the person with the largest number of seats in there an extraordinary amount of power. I want to finish.
But that's one of my. I'm not a socialist. It's one of my objections to the EU. It's constructed to make socialism impossible.
Yeah, well, moderate social democracy.
No, I mean, it's constructed to make social democracy impossible. I mean, if it had achieved all its goals, it would have done that. It would have been a vast neoliberal market of capital and labor. That's what it explicitly is. So what I find puzzling among on the left, moderate or radical left, is that they hold out these hopes and illusions about the EU. It's very explicit what the EU wants. They want a neoliberal continent.
Last question. You talk about the rise of hyper-liberal ideology and the woke religion of surplus elites. So I'm going to read this quote here. Hyper-liberal ideology plays a number of roles. It operates as a rationale for a failing variety of capitalism and a vehicle through which surplus elites struggle to secure a position of power in society. Insofar as it expresses a coherent system of ideas, it is the anti-Western creed of an antinomian intelligentsia that is ineffably Western. So this is fascinating.
There's a lot of packed into that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this idea that hyper liberalism, woke movement, etc., is drawing upon the intellectual reservoirs of Western liberalism in order to attack Western liberalism.
Yeah.
And you see really strong parallels between that and sort of late Tsarist Russia.
I do see some parallels, but the interesting point I would make now, I mean, there wouldn't have been the Russian Revolution if there hadn't been the First World War. Of course, there could be a bigger war than we've had so far. It could be that the United States would get into a war. I think it's quite unlikely, actually, but with China. And it's very unclear who would prevail or who would lose the most from that war. So there can be more than one comparison. But the key thing about the hyperliberals is, I think the key contradiction or paradox in them is that on the one hand, they're tremendously anti-Western, claim to be anti-colonial. They think Western societies are incurably rotten. Western civilization was a blot on the planet and on human history. And on the other hand, their ideological goals of deconstructing the self, of radical autonomy, are all hyperbolic versions of Western ideals. And not only that, they think that all the countries in the world will have to go through this process. They think that the Taliban must become liberal. Now, there may be anything wrong with the Taliban, in my view at least. But is there only one alternative, deconstructionist, radical hyperliberalism? They're not going to become like that. Most of the world isn't like that. Indeed, the hyperliberalism of America is strongest in the Anglosphere. Beyond that, it's weak. In Eastern post-communist Europe, it's very weak. In India, it's weak. In China, it's very weak. It's regarded in most of the world with a mixture of gleeful shadonoid and pitying contempt. Nobody admires it. And yet, it's very strong in the Anglosphere and many parts of the world. So America's in this strange paradoxical position now when hyperliberals are that America has no soft power in the world. I mean, there's no country in the world and no where there are strong majorities which see America as an ideal to be adopted. There are still people that emigrate to America from Latin America, Haiti, China to some extent, India. But it has no soft power. And yet this parochial, peculiar American ideology, which universalizes certain American dilemmas and problems, certain features of racism and colonialism, some of which are universal, but the ones that what they're universal is their own peculiar parochial history, has spread in many other parts of the world. So it's a projection of a hyperbolic projection of certain Western ideals and forms of thinking, Christianity to some extent, which is a cult of the victim, the Enlightenment, which is in part a cult of human autonomy, are radicalized to an extreme point. And then the idea is the whole world isn't going to become like that. 5 or 10 years from now, certainly 20 years from now, the situation in Britain and Europe and in America will be unrecognizably different, because this is not, I don't know what it'll be quite different from now, but it won't be one in which this is stable, hyper-liberal elite running everything. So there are huge movements of discontent, some of them very unpleasant movements, some of them horrifying movements in Europe and elsewhere, but there are vast movements, For example, in the song Rich Men North of Richmond in America, you've heard about that?
Yeah.
How many views did it get? Now, the left is furious about that, and the liberals are furious about this. I'm writing about this shortly. I've written about it in the New States, but they're furious about it because they say, well, it's not really a critique of capitalism. It's racism. Richmond was the capital of the Confederate regime and so on in the Civil War. It's all terrible stuff. But why has it got so many listeners? One of the reasons is surely that the marginalization and the suffering and the loss of a productive role of millions and millions of Americans, along with the stagnant incomes of millions and millions more, in other words, the rise of extreme inequality and so on, is being either ignored or very inadequately treated by the mainstream parties. That's the reason. So there's no way out of this situation. Put it into a very simple thing. Whoever wins the next presidential election in America will not be accepted as legitimate by at least a third of the population. So they've entered what Marxists used to call a legitimation crisis. They're already in it, and it will become acute after the next election, whoever wins, because whoever wins is not going to win by a sweeping majority. Worse than that, there'll be a large bloc, 20, 30, 40% maybe, who regard it as not just of Trumpists. What if Trump wins? He'll be regarded as illegitimate by liberals and Democrats. It's entered an irreversible period of legitimation crisis, which doesn't mean the state's going to collapse. It doesn't mean there's going to be anarchy. It doesn't mean there's going to be civil war like in the 1860s, but it does mean that it'll be a dysfunctional state which is semi-failed and probably will withdraw if there isn't an accidental big war before then, and probably will withdraw from some of its major commitments abroad, to begin with Ukraine, and possibly even its support for Taiwan. In other words, turn into there might be a goal of an autarkic kind of economy which America could achieve, if anyone can, it's probably the United States, mixed with a willingness to trade on negotiate terms with anybody, including China. So it could be that this whole anti-Chinese, it's more deeply rooted than the support for Ukraine, but it could be that this whole anti-Chinese, and by the way, I'm strongly critical of many aspects of the Chinese regime, and I also regard it as a threat. Espionage and other things are absolutely real. They're not made up by conspiracy theories. They're real threats. But America's not ready for war. It's not prepared for war. I'm not convinced it will fight a war, and that the economic interests of many sectors of American society wouldn't benefit from, because a lot of companies, America, it's unlike the Cold War, fundamental point. The relationship between America and China is completely unlike the Cold War because they're codependent economically, which the Soviet Union and the West was not in the Cold. It's a fundamentally different situation. So something different will happen out of it. War could happen by accident, but if it doesn't happen by accident, I think the most likely outcome is that America will fall in on itself, introvert, become even more introverted than it is really actually now. And that would fundamentally change the whole world geopolitical situation, including in Europe, because America's never been stronger in Europe than it is now. If the rug is pulled on that, what happens in Europe? Not just in Ukraine, but in other parts of it. What happens to the EU, for example? So I think we are approaching an historical juncture in which certain options, which have been options, will cease to be options, and other options will be sort of embedded for some time. And that's not a deterministic or a fatalistic view, but it's one which accepts the irreversibility of historical changes. Even neo-feudalism isn't feudalism, and also accepts that the situation that we're in now, politically speaking, is in some respects a tragic one.
John Gray, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you for the very interesting conversation in which you put counter arguments from which I've learned.
I'm very glad to hear it. My pleasure.
Thank you.